Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us for this special webinar. My name is Tim Gray. I'm Executive Director of Environmental Defence Canada. Environmental Defence is a leading Canadian environmental advocacy organization that works with government, industry, and individuals to defend clean water, safe climate, and healthy communities. I'm really pleased to welcome you tonight to today's live talk, second in a series that we've done looking at what's going on in Ontario and what we can do on protecting it together. So today we're talking about protecting Ontario's environmental future. We'll be asking what's next after the gutting of conservation authorities that occurred in Bill 229. And we'll be having a particular focus tonight on what we can do together and how we can help you in your community. First of all, I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. I would like to acknowledge that I'm calling here from Toronto on the traditional, ancestral, and unsurrendered territories of the Mississaugas of the New Credit, Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Huron-Wendat, who are the rightful title holders and stewards of this land, and that we were invited into the Dish with One Spoon Treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. Today, we're all calling in from different locations, and I encourage all of us who are non-Indigenous to learn about the land we are on today. As we start this webinar, let us keep in mind that it is Black, Indigenous, and people of color who have been and continue to be disproportionately impacted by pollution, climate change, and environmental injustice. So today we have a great speakers list for you, and I think you're going to find it really interesting, and I hope maybe even a little bit entertaining, considering the heaviness of some of the topics that we need to discuss tonight. First of all, we have Anastasia Lintner, who's Special Counsel at the Canadian Environmental Law Association, Anne Bell, who's the Director of Conservation and Education at Ontario Nature, and David Crombie, former Chair of the Greenbelt Council, former Mayor of Toronto, and former Cabinet Minister, and currently doing all kinds of really interesting things. Welcome, Anastasia, Anne, and David.
Thanks, Tim.
Thanks, Tim.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Thanks so much for joining us. Before we get started, I want to explain a bit how you can interact with us live on this webinar. If you're joining us on YouTube, there's a chat box at the right of your screen. Feel free to say hello or discuss with each other and send us your questions there. You will only be able to add comments if you're signed into YouTube, but if you don't have an account, don't worry. We'll be sending around a survey after this webinar where you have the opportunity to ask any additional questions. We usually get a large volume of questions, so we won't be able to answer them all, of course, but we'll try to answer as many possible, and I'm going to go through them and try and pull out some common themes. So our first speaker this evening is going to be Anastasia from the Canadian Environmental Law Association, and she's going to talk to us about the outcome of the review and of Bill 229 related to conservation authorities was and what's next. Anastasia, thanks for joining us.
I'm glad to be here with this very esteemed panel. Thank you so much for inviting me. My job tonight is to do three things. One, to thank you all. Secondly, to tell you a bit about what happened since we last had a webinar in mid-November, and tell you about what's coming up next in terms of policy reform, at least from what we understand at this point in time. And if you are at any point in time wishing you had a copy of our slides, they are available on our website right away. And I believe that the link to those slides that you can download is being posted for you to see right now. Before I jump into my 3 points, I'll just tell you a little bit about Canadian Environmental Law Association in case this is your first time hearing from us. We're a specialty legal clinic within the Ontario-wide system of clinics funded by Legal Aid Ontario. We work to seek environmental justice for those who are impacted by pollution, and we seek policy reform so that those kinds of impacts wouldn't happen in the first place. And I am a lawyer, and while I'll be speaking a lot about legal issues, nothing I say tonight should be construed as legal advice. If you need legal advice in your specific situation with your specific facts, please reach out and get some legal advice. And in our law reform or policy reform world, there's been a lot going on, and as Tim mentioned, Bill 229, it was introduced in November, at the beginning of November, and it was a budget measures bill. And so as we've seen more and more recently across lots of different governments, this bill contained many, many changes, over 40 schedules impacting many, many different pieces of legislation, including this Schedule 6 that amended the Conservation Authorities Act, as well as Schedule 8 that amended the Endangered Species Act related to forestry protections. And in among all of that, there was a fantastic and overwhelming public response just to this one schedule impacting the powers of conservation authorities. There were 45 deputations or presentations in front of standing committee. More than half of them were speaking out against Schedule 6, and more than 20 individual speakers spoke about this set of amendments and said that they were opposed. And we heard in our listening through the standing committee, we heard none in favor of the changes. And so I thank everybody that took the time to respond and step up and stand up and speak out for conservation in Ontario. It's really important. What was the policy? What was the response to all of this public outrage? Well, the government, who has a majority, the current government has a majority in the legislature, and they were able to ensure that the legislative process was expedited. It went through quite quickly with the final vote on the legislation December 8th, and it came into force. There were some amendments made at standing committee to Schedule 6 that impacted the membership of boards for conservation authorities, and also it made some changes to the role for land use, for the role for conservation authorities in land use planning appeals. These were responsive to the concerns that people were raising, so they're partially adjusted for that. And another thing that happened was a surprise, never seen before, proposed amendments by the government members on the standing committee that came into immediate effect on December 8th, related to what conservation authorities are able to do when there is a minister's zoning order. And so what this means is that if the Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing issues a zoning order, and the development that would be part of that zoning needs an authorization or a permit from Conservation Authority, the Conservation Authority is required to issue the authorization, even if under the normal course of events, they would have refused it. They would be able to put some conditions on that authorization, but the developer would be able to seek the Minister of Natural Resources and Forestry to review those conditions and change them. So this is very disappointing. It happened sort of in less than a day when these motions came forward. There was no public opportunity to speak to them, and they were put into place right away. Now, the remainder of what needs to be done in terms of conservation authorities implementation is that there's a lot of details that are still left to future regulations, and not very much has changed from the position we were in after Bill 108 made amendments to the Conservation Authorities Act in spring 2019. So that work still needs to be done. And so there's those implementing regulations are going to be required to be created. The government has announced a working group to assist them with what would go into these types of regulations. And at some point, we're anticipating we'll be able to see and have an opportunity, not necessarily see the regulations, but have an opportunity to speak to proposals about what those regulations are going to look like. And then also in terms of opportunities to speak to changes in public policy, right now, even though the expansion of ministers' zoning order powers were put into place in law last year under Bill 197, that there were no opportunities in terms of public comment. There was no notices on the environmental registry pursuant to the Environmental Bill of Rights in advance of Bill 197. And now there is an open registry notice so that you can respond to the government's proposals about expanding the minister's zoning order powers in this time from now until January 30th. And if you want to look at that notice proposal, there's a link that I think April has shared as well to give you an opportunity to go and look at it. Canadian Environmental Law Association is in the process of developing our comments on that, and we anticipate that we'll be able to make them public relatively soon. And then if you come back to our website, you should be able to see those and make use of them as you see fit. So I've thanked you. I hope that you will all continue to exercise your rights under the Environmental Bill of Rights to speak to environmental decision making in Ontario. And if you need more information or have questions, you can reach out to me. You could go to our social media channels at the Canadian Environmental Law Association, and definitely go back to our website. Stay tuned on our website. I expect there'll be more information about this coming forward. And that's all for me. So back to Tim.
Thanks so much, Anastasia. For those of you who are just joining us, we just heard from Anastasia Lintner, who's from the Canadian Environmental Law Association, and she has walked us through the changes that were made to conservation authorities in Ontario and what's coming next on that front, and also about the changes to minister zoning orders and the government's proposal to further increase their powers of those special designations. And next we have with us David Crombie. David was the chair of the Greenbelt Council, and he and 8 other members of the Greenbelt Council resigned over concerns about the impacts of the changes to the conservation authorities and the stripping of their ability to protect wetlands and other important natural values throughout Southern Ontario. He's going to speak to us about his perspectives on what's going on in Ontario and give us a little perspective from his vast experience on working on these issues over many decades. Welcome, David, and thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Tim, and thanks for the invitation. You know, when the government brought in the Bill 229, it not only was a direct attack on the mandate of conservation authorities, but it was also, it betrayed a kind of willful, if not woeful, ignorance of the historic contribution of conservation authorities to Ontario's health, safety, and prosperity. So I thought I might be helpful if I could provide a little historical context for the activities and mission of the conservation authorities. They are, of course, unique in North America. They were given legislative life in 1946, so this is their 75th birthday, ironically, and they were brought in at the same time as the Planning Act. And that's because in those days, it was believed that land use and environmental planning were simply two sides of the same coin, and that the new conservation authorities would be the guardians of our natural heritage. In the early years of the life of the conservation authorities, in the 40s, late 40s, 50s, 60s, it came at the same time as there was a massive urban growth in Ontario. And so it was not easy for the conservation authorities. It was like being a good cop on a bad and hard beat. They had to struggle against massive urbanization, and at the same time carry out best they could their orders under their mandate. There were some successes. Their value was felt very clearly in 1954 with Hurricane Hazel, but by and large, we had to wait for big changes for the latter decades of the 20th century and into the 21st century. And the big changes came in 3 forms. First of all, new ideas. Secondly, community activism. And thirdly, in government policies and legislation. The new ideas, interestingly enough, and perhaps appropriately enough, were simply new takes on old truths. And I think I can probably get to the core of them. There were many of them, but the core of them came from this. They believed and learned and understood that everything is connected to everything else, that we had a responsibility for the consequences of our acts, and therefore the idea that we could continue to move in, use up, throw away was no longer on. And thirdly, that the issues of ecology, economy, and community were not mutually exclusive, but indeed are mutually interdependent. Those ideas became live with a lot of community activism around the province. There were hotspots and areas of concern, issues everywhere popping up. And so in the lexicon of the day, you would have heard, and some of you might remember, the storm for the Oak Ridges moraine. Save the Oak Ridges moraine. Saga, save the Ganaraska again. Bring back the Don River. Save the Humber, the Rouge. I could go on. The activism was palpable, and they were trying to forge new understandings of their own environment and what they could do to save and deal with it. And then thirdly, with the new ideas and community activism, the government brought forward policies and programs and legislation. And so in 1983, we had the establishment of the Niagara Escarpment Commission. In 2002, the Oak Ridges Moraine legislation. In 2005, the Green Act, and in 2006, the growth legislation. And in 2016, the integration of all of those four into what was known as the Planning for Health, Prosperity, and Growth, 2015 to 2041. Now, I go through that list, and it is historic weeds, but it's important because it also spoke at the same time of the general philosophy and understanding of the mandate of the conservation authorities, because the conservation authorities played an historic role in all of these historic changes. So they deserve our appreciation and our respect, not the back of the hand. They need to be able to strengthen their mandate, not weaken the mandate. So how we treat, and this is an important point, I think, how we treat conservation authorities in this province will tell us how we will treat our environment. If the conservation authorities are diminished, so are we. And if they flourish, so will we. Thanks very much, Tim.
Thanks so much, David. For those of you who are just joining us, we just heard from David Crombie, the former chair of the Greenbelt Council, and his view on the importance of conservation authorities and why the rolling back of their ability to protect the environment is so important to all of us and so important to our future. Next, we're going to hear from Ann Bell, who's the Director of Conservation and Education at Ontario Nature. Ann, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Tim. And thanks everybody for joining the webinar tonight. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm trying to advance my slide, but it's not working. Did I get an assistance from somebody on advancing the slide? Well, I'll just proceed without my slides and hopefully I can catch up with them later. For those of you who aren't familiar with Ontario Nature, we are a membership-based charitable conservation organization that represents over 30,000 individual members and supporters and over 150 member groups across Ontario. Our mission is to protect wild species and wild spaces through conservation, education, and public engagement. Hold on, maybe I wonder what I need to do. Maybe I need to do. Oh, there it is. Sorry, folks. If someone is advancing my slides, could you please go to the next slide? Thanks. My presentation tonight is going to focus on three very troubling issues: minister's zoning orders, wetland offsetting, and the pay-to-slay fund for endangered species. Next slide. There's good reason for everyone in Ontario to be concerned about minister's zoning orders, or MZOs, a tool that's being used to fast-track development across Ontario. MZOs are issued by the Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing without opportunity for public consultation. Normally, because we have an Environmental Bill of Rights, any policy proposals affecting the environment are posted for public consultation on the Environmental Registry. But this isn't the case for MZOs, which also override requirements for public consultation under the Planning Act. So they're the perfect tool for sneaking through development approvals and escaping public notice. And once an MZO is in place, the public has no opportunity for appeal. The only option left is to convince the minister to revoke the MZO. Next slide, please. So how does the public find out about MZOs? Well, it's not easy, especially if you want to find out before they are issued. In that case, we need people locally watching what's on the agenda of councils. After that, you can find out, after the fact, you can find out about MZOs on the Environmental Registry or by searching regulations under the Planning Act. But again, it's after the fact, and neither of these sources provides the kind of detail needed to really understand what's going on. MZOs weren't created by this government. They're an existing tool, and the intent has always been to allow the minister to directly zone land for particular purposes. In the past, however, MZOs were seldom used, except in places where there weren't municipal plans or bylaws in place, or where the government wanted to advance a provincial interest. For example, in 2009, MZOs were used to give effect to the Lake Simcoe Protection Plan, stipulating that there was to be no development on land set aside for agriculture, nature conservation, flood control, and outdoor recreation. Next slide, please. Lately, we've seen a flurry of activity around MZOs for very different purposes. The Auditor General of Ontario wrote about this in one of her environmental audits last November. She noted the sharp increase in the use of MZOs. There are a variety of MZOs being issued. Ontario Nature's major concern is with those that are being used to authorize residential or commercial developments on lands previously zoned for agriculture or environmental protection. Next slide. Honestly, developers smell blood. It's a dreamed of opportunity to push development through, especially in places where it would not normally have been tolerated. And developers have a provincial government and many municipal governments who are willing to play ball. The COVID pandemic is providing great cover for all of this. First, because so many people and communities are struggling to cope and so aren't able to pay attention. And second, because the development projects are going forward, as a way of getting the economy up and running again. And here's an example on this slide. A flyer distributed to all households by the City of Pickering earlier this month to justify building a warehouse that will destroy about 20 hectares of provincially significant wetland. The flyer makes reference to both COVID-19 and local jobs in the economy. It claims that the development will not come at the expense of the environment, despite the wetland destruction, which it doesn't mention. Next slide. But the community is not to be fooled. Every day, there are local watchdogs visiting the wetland site, keeping an eye on what is going on. They organized a protest last Saturday and are planning more. Meanwhile, Ontario Nature and Environmental Defence, represented by EcoJustice, are taking the government to court. We're seeking to have the MZO declared unlawful for failing to comply with provincial law and policy protecting wetlands. Next slide. People are waking up to the threat of MZOs elsewhere too, and another great example of the way communities are fighting back is Stratford. There, an MZO was issued for a glass factory to be developed on 175 acres of prime farmland. Two citizens groups have formed, Get Concerned Stratford, and Wise Communities. Together, they've been reaching out through Zoom meetings, video, social media, and their websites. They've been organizing demonstrations, they've done polling, they've got the support of the Perth Federation of Agriculture, they've been getting coverage in local and national media, and they're engaging with the mayor and the city council as well as the federal government. It's an impressive example of grassroots organizing and resistance. Next slide. I'd like to shift now to the issue of wetland offsetting, which of course overlaps with MZOs, as in the case of the Pickering wetlands. For those who aren't familiar with the concept of wetland offsetting, it's basically a trade-off. The damage done when wetlands are destroyed for development is offset by the recreation or restoration of wetlands elsewhere. It sounds good in theory, except that in practice, it seldom works. We just don't have the know-how. Fens, bogs, swamps, and some types of marshes cannot be recreated. They're irreplaceable. Further, the local benefits of the wetland are lost forever. What comfort is it to the people of Pickering and Ajax that someone, at some point, will recreate a wetland somewhere else? Though offsetting may be justified in certain cases, it should be treated as a last resort, not as a justification for destruction and riding roughshod over existing environmental protections. Next slide. And yet that's exactly what is happening. Even provincially significant wetlands, which enjoy the highest level of protection under the Planning Act, are now vulnerable. The Pickering wetland isn't the first. Before that was an MZO for construction of a Walmart distribution facility impacting three provincially significant wetlands and farmland in Vaughan. Even more recently, Ramera Township has requested an MZO for a development complex impacting provincially significant wetlands on the shores of Lake Couchiching. It feels like open season on wetlands. Next slide. You may remember the government's good news announcement in December about a $30 million wetland fund at the exact same time that it was ramming through the changes to the Conservation Authorities Act. One of the conservation authorities called it a distraction, which it certainly was. It was a classic case of seeking green cover. But more than that, this wetland fund will be financed almost entirely through wetland offsetting. That is, money that developers will pay to destroy wetlands. So the fund is premised on destruction. You can expect to hear more about the government's plans for wetland offsetting in the coming months, but don't be fooled into thinking it's good news. Next slide. And a similar fund is being set up for species at risk. Right before the holidays, the government consulted on its proposed Species at Risk Conservation Fund, known by skeptics like me as pay to slay. I guess the government figured that December was as good a time as any to consult the public on pay to slay. Since the rest of us were battling the Conservation Authority changes, we were fighting MZOs, dealing with COVID, and trying to clear away a mountain of other tasks before the holidays. The less attention we could muster, the better for them. Again, they did their best to make it sound like good news, but it is not. Next slide. The so-called Conservation Fund is about making it easier and quicker for development to proceed in places that are protected by law, the habitat of threatened and endangered species. Though offsetting has always been part of the structure of the Ontario Endangered Species Act, this fund takes it to a new level. First, pay to slay will make it easier for industry and development proponents to get an authorization to destroy habitat. Just cut a check and you are off the hook. Second, though proponents of harmful activities will still have to minimize harm, paying into the fund means that they no longer have to compensate for the harm done by providing an overall benefit to the species. In fact, with the fund, no one is on the hook to provide an overall benefit anymore, though it was intended to be a key requirement under the Endangered Species Act. Further, there's no requirement tying fund monies to the species or places where the harm occurs. Fund monies are pooled, so payments into the fund for the destruction of, for example, meadowlark habitat could be used to benefit any of the other fund species. And finally, some communities will see valued natural areas destroyed or degraded, likely with no local reparation whatsoever for the loss of ecological, cultural, spiritual, recreational, aesthetic, or economic values of those sites. Next slide. If you'd like to know more about pay to slay, I invite you to read our joint submission with Environmental Defence and other organizations, which you can find on the Ontario Nature website. Next slide. Despite the many challenges we face, I'd like to end my presentation with a photo that always makes me smile, and words from David Crombie, who's an inspiration to us all. The good news is there's a broad coalition of people and organizations now emerging across the province. They, too, are fighting back. And you know what? The politicians who are responsible are feeling the heat. That's why the province is seeking green cover and consulting on legislative changes after the fact. That's why the mayor of Stratford is sitting in on Zoom calls organized by community groups. And that's why Pickering is sending out misleading brochures. Our job now is to keep turning up the heat. And on that note, I'll pass the mic back to Tim Gray. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Anne. I am going to give a little bit of an overview of some of the other aspects of the changes that have been made to environmental rules that govern protection in Ontario. And I just start with my slide here that really what we've seen overall is removing of the guardrails. We need to have economic development. We need to make room for more people to live in Ontario. We need to have places for businesses to grow, etc. But that needs to be done within a framework that protects other values and protects our future. And the current government has been busily removing the guardrails that guide that prosperity. Also, I'm going to speak a little bit to what next in terms of what we can offer collectively to support work that you're all doing at the community level, and give you some ideas about what to do next yourselves at a local level. So one of the major things that's occurred, in addition to the minister's zoning orders, which dive in and give permission to particular projects in particular areas, is a widespread movement in this government to roll back 3 or 4 decades of improving planning rules that help to protect nature and guide our cities to develop in a more sustainable way. This has happened over the last couple of years, started in 2019. And as Anne has outlined, one of the highlights that we see of that and the most visible aspects of this are these minister's zoning orders, because they swoop in and override particular municipalities' ability to protect values or to have any say about what kind of a development is going to occur in a particular area. But there's also broader changes that have occurred to the Planning Act, to the Growth Plan. And what these things have done is that they've changed the rules so that less density is required for development in our existing towns and cities. So instead of building townhouses and condominiums and others in our cities and building more densely in our existing towns, building 3-story buildings, etc., is that those requirements have been loosened. And now, as well, cities and towns, as they do their new municipal plans, which have to be done over the next couple of years, are going to be doing that, projecting the type of housing that was wanted in the past. That is, what did the marketplace show that people purchased back in the 1970s and 1980s? And these new plans that will be coming forward, so the municipal plan for York and Durham, etc. All of these areas are then going to take in a lot more farmland and natural areas into their boundaries. And instead of planning for the next 10 or 20 years, they're going to expand their boundaries for all projected growth out to 2051. And we know that all municipalities except for Toronto and Peel did not grow as much as we expected over the last 10 or 15 years. And in fact, there's massive surpluses of land within the existing boundaries before we expand them. So in most cases, except for those 2 areas, there's no need for additional land to meet future business and housing needs. But because this government is so focused on allowing developers to gobble up more natural heritage and farmland, we're going to see proposals coming forward that are significantly more aggressive than we've seen in the past. So what can we expect from this? Well, as Anne has outlined, we're going to see a lot more development in formerly protected areas, so wetlands, forests, etc. Massive expansions proposed to urban boundaries around our major cities. So the farmland that is just outside the boundaries, you're going to see proposals for taking in thousands of hectares of that farmland and converting it to urban expansion. That, of course, means loss of farmland, forests, and wetlands. This is all going to be very low density development, so large tract of subdivisions, very car dependent. When you do develop at very low densities, that's very, very difficult to serve with public transit because the densities just aren't there to make it economically viable. And of course, increased gridlock, increase travel and commute times, and therefore the resulting lost productivity and economic impacts that are associated with that form of development. On the a related issue is massive changes to our action on climate change and on transportation. And these are interrelated, of course, because transportation and buildings are the two biggest sources of emissions in Ontario. So, and transportation, of course, is very, very tied to the form of development that we're promoting. So as I'm sure you all know, Ontario's Climate Change Action Plan was cancelled by the incoming government. And a huge portion of this action plan was focused on transportation, electric vehicle subsidies, electric vehicle charging infrastructure, regional rail programs that were meant to be electrified, public transit in major urban areas. You'll recall the massive amounts of cancellations of public transit that occurred, in particular in places like Hamilton, etc. So all of that was canceled with the cancellation of the Climate Change Action Plan. In addition, a real pivot away from encouraging public transit and regional transit to an old style approach to transportation planning that is focused on highways. And to enable that, the provincial government has weakened the environmental assessment rules as they apply to highways, and has brought forward proposals for major new 400 series highways. So this one on this map shows the proposed GTA West Highway, or Highway 413, and that would link between Highway 400 up around King, circle north of Bolton, across the north end of Brampton, and come down into through just to the east of Georgetown and join the 401, 407 area. It's just, as you can see, not very far north of the existing 407, and was canceled following a review by an expert panel by the previous government. It goes through the Greenbelt, and it crosses the tributaries of the Etobicoke Creek, the Credit River, and the Humber 85 times, as well as destroying the best remaining natural habitats in York Region, according to the work that's been done by the conservation authorities and by the city of Vaughan itself. The other proposed highway that is out there and has been restarted after having been dormant for a long time is the proposed connection between Highway 404 and the 400. It's called the Bradford Bypass by the Ministry of Transportation. We like to call it the Holland Marsh Expressway, because this proposed 4-lane highway will cross the Holland River twice and go through the Holland Marsh, provincially significant wetland. No mitigation is proposed for this highway, and the environmental assessment work that was done is now about 25 years old. And in both cases, this highway and proposed Highway 413, the developers and the pro-development municipalities talk openly of these highways being a vector for turning the land along them into developable space for commercial and residential development. So not only do you have the highway going through these incredibly sensitive areas, but the proponents of them see it as a tool for planning, that once they can push these highways through, that they'll try and get all the land near them rezoned for development, pushing development out into natural and intact areas right now. And we see that actually happening in real time with existing highways like the 400 and the 404, where they go through the Greenbelt. Many developers have been pushing to have those Greenbelt lands taken out of the Greenbelt and converted to employment lands or development. But as Anne was talking about, giving you a couple of examples where people are fighting back, this is something that's come together over the last couple of years, is a whole number of organizations that work at the provincial and regional level have come together to fight for Ontario's future. And we're calling that effort Ontario Yours to Protect. Right now we have 19 organizations that have joined that, and we're always looking for more. And we also have had some real success fighting back on some of the things that this government has tried to do. In particular, many of you were involved with fighting back against Bill 66, Schedule 10. That was the proposition to open the Greenbelt itself to new subdivisions, new factories, new development. We organized and mobilized, and the pushback was so strong that the government removed that portion of the legislation from Bill 66. In addition, there was a proposal last year to change the Aggregate Resources Act and allow quarries to be developed in endangered species habitat. And the pushback that came from all of you at the MPP level resulted in that proposal being withdrawn. So we actually have won some of these issues at a provincial level. We were less successful at the Conservation Authority's work, and that's why we also need to work on the ground. Because as these changes to municipal planning occur, as boundary expansions become huge and are taking in all these important areas, as we move away from denser human-friendly development towards a return to 1960s and 70s sprawl, and as MZOs are used to authorize development in previously protected areas, we're going to need to fight these areas. And we actually have won some of these, or at least one so far. There was a proposal for a minister's zoning order in the Carruthers Creek headwaters, right adjacent to the Greenbelt at the upper end of Carruthers Creek. That was being put forward by the development community, and we managed to stop that from going forward by blocking it at Durham Council. There was a proposal for an MZO at Mary Lake in King Township to develop a massive hotel complex on the Oak Ridges Moraine in the Greenbelt. Citizens mobilized there and have stopped that at King Township Council so far. And Friends of Simcoe County Forest worked to stop an MZO for a waste site in the Freel Forest in Simcoe County. So we actually have won some of these, and we're mobilizing to make it possible to defeat more of these. And this just gives you some example of some of the other things that are underway and coming in the future. People are mobilizing around the highways that I mentioned. Anne mentioned the MZO around in Stratford, around prime farmland. There's a mega development that would house up to 150,000 people just to the west of Lake Simcoe on Simcoe County farmland. There's a proposal to bulldoze habitat for piping plover at Sable Beach. New sewage plant in the Credit Water headwaters. The list goes on, and people are mobilizing around these issues. I think we're being forced to return to some of the times that David talked about, where it required individual citizen action to block unplanned development that had very, very little legislative or regulatory oversight. And our current government is returning us to that time where local level conflict is going to be the only way that we can protect our environment. So what's next coming up this year? We are offering collectively as the groups that are working under Yours to Protect resources, and we're going to be expanding them this year. So right now there's a website for information on key hotspots, media coverage of these issues, resources on how to respond to your MPP letters that you're getting that are greenwashing what they're up to. You can find all of that at yourstoprotect.ca. You can also find connection with others who are working on local issues through talking to our staff at Environmental Defense or through Ontario Nature or through CELA, and we can link you with other people. We can also offer advice and support. There's staff at Environmental Defense, and as I mentioned, Ontario Nature, CELA can offer legal advice. There are regional groups that have specific expertise about how to contact your local council or their experience with working with particular council members and work on strategy, et cetera, within your local area. And we can help you find those people if you get in touch with us. Upcoming this year, we're looking to be starting to offer community group financial support. So if you're working on a particular project to protect the environment in your community and need help to organize or to hold events, we're going to be having some financial support available. More information and training webinars on particular issues, so ones like this, but diving down deeper into specific issues. A new online newsletter to profile the local projects that you're working on, upcoming this year. And more in-person events and communities, we hope, once COVID becomes something that is behind us and we can actually meet in person to get the energy and momentum that comes from being able to work together in real time and face-to-face. And that's the end of my presentation. So back to where, so now we have a lot of questions that have come in, and I am going to try and pick some of the highlights because there are so many of them, and I'm going to route them to the most appropriate presenter that I can think of here. One that I saw a little bit earlier, just before I started my presentation, that I thought was really important to answer because I saw it asked a few times, and I'm gonna give this one to Anastasia. I'm gonna paraphrase, but people were asking, all of the wetlands and other things that are going to be developed, can't we just buy them and protect them? And I think that's an important kind of question because I think it needs to be clarified, who owns these lands now quite often, and why is it that we use zoning rather than purchase to protect a lot of the lands that are wetlands or river valleys, etc. Why don't we just buy them all? So maybe Anastasia, maybe you could answer that, and of course anyone else wants to chime in afterwards, but I'll give it to Anna first because it's sort of a legal question in a way.
Yeah, kind of. So of course, there is a lot of ecologically sensitive lands that are put into protection either by a private owner protecting them, like our land trusts, or somebody else deciding that that's the kind of the use of their private property. And also we might have public lands that are clearly legally protected under protected areas legislation, for example. And then just generally from an ecosystem perspective, it's not going to make sense. And Annabelle will probably want to speak to this too, right? It doesn't make sense to create a working ecosystem that can support biodiversity and help us build resilience to climate change if we're only doing it on these like little parcels of fragmented land. So putting it kind of into private property or public lands that are kind of locked down for protection versus pave them over, it's not going to make sense for achieving the kinds of goals that we want overall.
Yeah, and I just add to that that we cannot rely on outright purchase, at scale, like as Anastasia is saying. And quite often you will see developers arguing, well, if you don't want me to develop it, then you should pay me for it. But that perspective ignores the fact that it's the rest of society that bears the burden for the development. If you destroy a wetland that is protecting the watershed or protecting species or allowing groundwater infill, it's not the developer that suffers the consequences for that. It's the people in the rest of the community that no longer get those ecological services. And in fact, this is playing out with the discussion around possible compensation for destruction of wetlands. I was talking to someone within a conservation authority, and they were saying that if they accurately charge the developers for the actual cost of the damage that would be done by destroying some of these very large provincially significant wetlands, they would be in the orders of tens of millions of dollars. Of course, the developer is not going to want to pay that, but that's the consequence to the environment if you're trying to compensate for that by building infrastructure to compensate for the flooding, et cetera. I mean, it really is very, very expensive to allow the destruction of these areas. Does anyone else want to comment on that? Why we can't buy up all the land that needs to be protected?
We just don't have that much money.
There's that too. There's another question here. What is the name of the Developers Association? I can answer that quickly. It's the Ontario Home Builders Association is one of the key one. And the other one is BUILD. And yes, they do lobby extensively on these issues. And somebody had asked a related question, which was, what are some of the key companies that build houses that have been lobbying heavily on these issues? And two of the big ones are Mattamy Homes, which is one of the largest home builders in North America, and the other is Fieldgate Homes, which you'll see as a retailer of tract housing in Ontario as well. They've both been very involved in lobbying on the conservation authorities issue in particular. And Mattamy Homes was one of the largest contributors to the Ontario Proud Facebook campaign during the last election that was very much pro the current government. About $500,000 in attack ads on Facebook were put together by Ontario Proud, and Mattamy was the largest single sponsor of that. So there's definitely a tie between some of the major developers and both lobbying, but also contribution to the current government and demands for rollback of environmental protection. Another question here. Oh, how do we find out if an MZO application is happening in our area? That's a really good question. And currently you won't, because there's no notice provided, there's no public consultation, nothing provided by the municipality. Unless there's some very short notice provided that the municipality is going to actually support the MZO. So in a few cases, we've known a few days beforehand that a council is going to consider supporting the MZO. That was the case in the Mary Lake area that I mentioned up in King Township. We had a few days, and the people locally were able to organize and get to that council meeting and get council to not support the MZO. But if that meeting doesn't happen, and it doesn't need to because the minister does not need municipal support, then you wouldn't necessarily know. However, we are producing a map that is going to show all of the MZOs that we know of. That'll be on the Yours to Protect site very soon, as well as a table that has all of the MZOs and some details around what they contain. So we'll be putting that out there. But new ones, we only find out of them as they get posted or as people at the local community level hear about them because they show up on council agendas. And then we can start working on them or highlight the upcoming council meeting about them to local people. Question for David. The Ford government has a track record of retreating on controversial legislation in the face of public criticism. How do we apply more pressure to get them to change their strategy and stop doing this?
Well, in many ways, what is already happening, you have to do it at basically two levels. One, at the level of policy change and therefore dealing directly with parliamentary caucuses, with figures who have power and influence at Queen's Park. But as Tim and the others, both Anna and Ann were saying, it is at the local level as it was 30 years ago and 25 years ago and many years ago. It is always at the local level that politicians and bureaucrats will feel the pressure. So it needs to be a combination of policy activity for legislation, but at the same time pushed very hard by local activity. And that's the only way to make the change. I think the changes are possible right now. I think that there's already gathering forces that are looking for legislative changes as well as at the local level changes in specific projects. Bear in mind that governments live in a vote economy, and to the extent that you can influence what will happen to them in an election, then they'll pay attention. And I think right now you're seeing much of that already happening. The forces that are at our local are being joined by forces that are more general within the province. The Globe and Mail editorial today is an example of that. And so I think that we're already moving well. The problem is communication, making sure that we understand where the MZOs are coming from, where they think they're going to be, but at the same time pressuring the provincial government to come forward with recommendations on how they're going to change the use of MZOs, as they've now weaponized them beyond what they were originally. And so, in fact, we sent a letter to the minister some time ago saying it's essential that you pause MZOs and establish a public discussion on how you're now going to use MZOs in the future, rather than having people change it after the fact.
Thanks, David. Another question here. Oh, people would really like to know, this is asked a couple of times, how can people support the conservation authorities going forward with these MZOs being applied and the conservation authorities now being in a position where they have to issue a permit to allow the destruction? What can people do locally when one of these things is issued for a wetland or a forest that before the conservation authority would have been able to protect? What can they do there? Anybody who wants to answer that one?
Well, the pressure, if I could, the pressure from the local level is still important. The government, in a sense, hides behind the proposition that they are only doing this at the request of the local government. That, by the way, is not essentially true, but that's what they say. And so the more the local government is not supporting it, the more it won't happen. And so big pressure at the local level, not just on local councillors, but at least as important on the MLAs.
Yeah, I think that's really important as well, David, is to mention that the province has been saying that they would like to have council support for MZOs. So it's really important to ensure that the council doesn't provide that support. If you can even know that it's happening, because in some cases we don't know. But if you do know, get to your council and make sure they don't support it. If they do issue one, in terms of the conservation authorities, they are going to need to hear when these issues come up that the people within that community really do not want to see a permit issued. And so that the conservation authority doesn't end up getting pushed into doing it, but rather says back to the province, if you want to develop this area, you issue the permit. I think it's very important, because then the province itself takes responsibility. The MPP for that area, if it's a government MPP, they have to take responsibility for the destruction of that area in their community. And I think that's going to be very important politically going forward. So work with your conservation authority on these issues and make sure that they don't get bullied into issuing a permit, but instead force the province to do it themselves. And then they can be held accountable for it. Somebody's asked for the new Conservation Authority working group that is going to determine the regulations and the rules for what the conservation authorities can do. How come there aren't any NGOs appointed to that working group? How come all the people there are either just from conservation authorities or from the development industry? And I think there's a farm representative as well. But why no NGOs? Anastasia, any thoughts on that?
Well, just let me say that the working group won't be able to establish the regulations. That's one thing. If there were, as I understand it, this working group is to sort of give some input, but ultimately it's going to be the government who's going to make these regulations, and they may or may not listen to or take advantage of any advice that they get. As to, I can't read the government's mind, so I don't know why there aren't any environmental representatives. It's certainly been in the way they describe the stakeholders. It's not the environmental sector. The environmental interests are often not mentioned, but rather these other kind of land interests, agriculture, landowners, stakeholders, the conservation authorities themselves. That's the language that's been used many times, and so perhaps it's not surprising, but extremely disappointing.
And any thoughts?
Well, I think I'm going to be a little bit less tactful than Anastasia, maybe. They've put the people on, they want a certain kind of advice. They want to be able to say, oh, well, we have this advisory group and they've told us to do this and that's what we're going to do. So they put people on the advisory group who are going to give them exactly the advice that they want, which isn't necessarily the advice that that the rest of us might want. In fact, it's very likely not.
Can I also point out, Tim, that the distance that they can go to change anything of importance by regulation is limited by the fact that the regulations can't go beyond the principles already adopted in the bill. So yes, the idea that somehow you're going to be able to change the bad news by regulation is at least technically not even possible, because you can't make regulations that go beyond the principles of the bill, which is why what they need to do is go back where they were before and have a public discussion, and not try and have discussion after they've already passed the law.
Absolutely. I mean, the law needs to be repealed. Question for Anne. Can you speak to some of the vital ecosystem services and functions that provincially significant wetlands provide? And how do we make the public understand or care more about these? Because I'm not sure that a lot of people really understand the value of wetlands. Maybe you can just talk to that a little bit.
Sure. Well, I think the easiest one for the most people to understand is the importance of wetlands in an era of climate change, both with respect to controlling floods and also with respect to storing water. We all understand that we are heading to some very difficult times, and wetlands are the part of that landscape that's going to make a big difference in terms of our ability to adapt to the impacts of climate change and what's anticipated. Wetlands are also an incredibly important part of the landscape with respect to biodiversity. I think it's 20% of species at risk rely on wetlands, and they're just a haven for biodiversity again, which is threatened are all over the place, and which we are struggling to protect. So if we want to address biodiversity decline, biodiversity loss, we need to keep wetlands on the landscape. I think as well, there are cultural values, spiritual values of wetlands. I think Indigenous communities hold wetlands very close to their hearts, very important for them, for their practicing their traditional practices, hunting, gathering, medicinal plants, and so on. Very important for those reasons. Many of us love wetlands for recreation. I'm a birder. I love going to wetlands because that's where I can see lots of wonderful birds, but canoeing and all those sorts of things as well. So there are many different values that wetlands support. And I think one of the things that we need to do with the story around wetlands is convey, I hate to say it, convey a sense of the loss. I mean, when we're talking about wetlands like those Pickering wetlands, we have to realize what's already been lost in the GTA in terms of wetlands. It's over 85%. Parts of the province, it's over 90%. So we're talking about great loss, and we're the few wetlands that remain in this part of the province, and we need to protect them.
Thanks, Anne.
Sure.
There's another one here that I thought was related. Someone asking, how do you talk about these issues in small towns? Maybe not just a small town, but how do you talk about these issues, generally to your friends? There, someone's asking, if you talk about them, then people think that you're being hyperbolic and that you alienate people if you talk about the threats to these wetlands. So what's the entry point for a conversation about the importance of these areas, especially for a society where we live in, where ecological information and ecological knowledge is not top of mind quite often, because many of us are not taught anything about these things. So how do you start to have these conversations? David, any thoughts from your many years in politics? How do you talk to people about the value of watersheds and wetlands and stuff without making it sound like you're a crazed environmentalist, as some of us get accused of being?
Well, I think Anne's a birder. There are lots of people who are walkers, and I've been one of them all my life. And anybody who wants to understand the value of a wetland or a woodlot or all of those things that our natural heritage has to offer, all they have to do is go for a walk. It's the cheapest form of entertainment. It's life at 3 miles an hour, and it gives a sense of peace and a sense it's good for your mental health. And I might say that increasingly people are understanding conservation authorities as places where they can go and enjoy and understand and feel better. So there's lots of people, and that's going to increase, in my judgment, in a post-pandemic world. People are really going to be looking for things of value that are not expensive, and you're finding that increasingly with the ravine stuff. I belong to ravine groups. I mean, the Toronto ravine, there's 300 kilometers of ravines in Toronto alone. And it's an old cliche now, but it's true when Hugh Hood, the old novelist, said about it, that the ravines in Toronto, the ravines are to Toronto what the canals are to Venice. So it's a natural heritage, doesn't cost much, and increasingly people want to know about it. The one place where we could do some work is to cheer on those people in our education systems who are wanting to find ways in which to get kids involved in ravines, in the sense that they learn how to plant trees, all of that kind of stuff. So there's lots of good community programs that are possible. And I would get in touch with the local trustee, see what they're doing in their area. But I would look around for people simply using ravines and wetlands and all of that and discovering nature. Kids love nature. Grandkids love nature. And I'm just finding out that great-grandkids also like nature.
That's great. Someone's asking, is it too late to stop the Durham Live MZO, which is the development proposed for the provincially significant wetland in Pickering? And why don't you speak to that, since we're working on that?
It's not too late. No way. It's not too late. We have to fight this, and we're going to fight it. And it's not just the people you see on the screen here tonight, but it's lots of people locally. People are upset. This is a watershed moment, really. If this provincially significant wetland goes down, we are in big trouble. So there's no way we can give up on this issue.
No, I agree. I mean, we're going to court, as Anne mentioned, Environmental Defence and Ontario Nature, as represented by Eco Justice, challenging the minister's ability to issue this MZO. Folks on the ground are organizing. There's 2 government MPPs that are nearby. Rod Phillips, who got himself in a little bit of trouble, you may have noticed over the Christmas holidays, and Peter Bethlen-Falvey, who is now the finance minister, are both the local representatives. And because the government has passed the changes to this, the Conservation Authorities Act, they now are the final decision makers on the issuance of a permit to destroy this wetland. And they have to be stopped, and they have to be held accountable. It's really worth seeing this site if you haven't. It's a very large wetland. It's part of a larger complex. And as Anne said, if a wetland of this size in an urban setting that's this rare can be destroyed, then there's nothing that is going to be off limits in the future. So it's very, very important to protect this area for sure. Question here for for Anastasia. Is there any recourse related to these MZOs and other changes under the Environmental Bill of Rights? Is there anything that protects the public interest under the Environmental Bill of Rights?
So when there is a minister's zoning order issued, and there's been an ability under the Planning Act for the minister to issue zoning orders, and I think there was a comment earlier about sometimes these things are used to do very beneficial public projects in a more expedited way. So it's not that every MZO is always going to be bad. What's been alarming is that
Oh, I think Anastasia's connection has gone bad on us. I think we'll go to another question just so that we can see if she comes back. Oh, sorry, and I think you got cut off there a little bit.
I'm having this lovely, every once in a while my internet just decides to be unstable. Yeah, so I was just saying that the escalation of using what used to be an extraordinary kind of exceptional power has been used much more often, and then the changes to the way it's used. But I was going to add that the expedited process of having a minister issue the zoning order gets around the normal ways in which a community member or municipality might get involved and take it and appeal it to the Land and Planning Appeals Tribunal. But so those kinds of routes are now taken away, and the minister's zoning order, if it's going to be challenged in litigation, that's challenged under what's called judicial review. So that it's not that litigation or challenges aren't possible, they're just very difficult because there isn't a mechanism that kind of has a way that the public can get involved and then seek leave to appeal. And the other thing I wanted to say is that it's also the case that Environmental Bill of Rights, when they give you an information notice about a minister's zoning order being passed, it's not actually triggering the opportunity to use that process of seeking leave to appeal pursuant to the Environmental Bill of Rights. So in terms of the potential to challenge, it's limited, not impossible. It's going to depend on the facts.
Great, thank you. And one last question, because I think we are going to wrap up in the next few minutes. But another question related to consultation is how can development in significant areas like these wetlands occur without First Nation or Indigenous consultation? Another one for you, I think, Anna.
Well, certainly one of the challenges generally is that there is clearly a duty to consult, and in the way that the Canadian law has interpreted this, to have a kind of spectrum of how much consultation and whether or not there's accommodation of Indigenous interests and rights. The situation that we see is that the way in which the governments, they are obligated, there is a duty to consult and they are obligated, but the way in which they exercise or make good on those obligations is not always fulfilled in a manner that is consistent with what's required. And then the recourse is that an Indigenous community has to continue to seek to have those duties and obligations met, not sort of that we don't see our governments going out and proactively doing a really good job of duty consult. And then the way that a community has to fight back against that is to, ask for it and then potentially have to challenge such decisions.
Great, thank you. And one final question, and then I think we're going to wrap up for this evening. But I think this is one for all of us to answer, and that is, if we take a step back and look forward, how do we ensure that these are key issues in the next election? Given all that's going on, COVID and chaos in the United States and all kinds of other stuff that is distracting, what is it going to take to ensure that the fate of our environment and the fate of our future prosperity is top of mind and a top election issue as we get to the next provincial election. So, Anne, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Well, I think, again, we've emphasized all night the importance of speaking up locally, but that's obviously the case with this. Speaking up at all party candidate meetings, and even before that, if you happen to know people in certain parties, and if you can suggest that these issues need to be part of the platform, they need to be addressed, and that you're expecting these parties to have a strong environmental platform. It doesn't even have to be that specific. It just needs to be an overall expectation that this is what we want from any government that's going to lead this province after the next election. We want people to make it possible that no government with an anti-environment agenda is going to get elected next time around.
Absolutely. Anna.
Oh, it's yeah, I don't have much to add to that very eloquent way of speaking up. It's up to us to make sure that our elected officials know that these things matter to us in the ways that we have been doing, and to just continue sustain that effort through to the next election.
And David, you've been the focus of public pressure around electoral outcomes in the past, very personally. What's your advice to people to ensure that this is a top of mind issue as we approach the next election?
Being engaged in local initiatives to start something is not some simple matter. It's actually the first step to the democratic process. Democracy is a self-starting event. And it's not done by somebody else. It's first of all done by you. Secondly, it's done by you talking to somebody else to get them involved. And then you have to reach out to places like you were saying earlier, Tim. Environmental Defense offers some thoughts to them, how they might want to organize, find ways in which they can get resources. There is nothing that you can't do if you want to organize and pay attention to it. It's always a question of bringing together people, money or resources, and ideas. We've got the ideas. We know what we need to stop, and we know what we need to start. So the plea is for people to simply get involved with their own, and then they can reach out to others as well.
Thank you so much. I think that's exactly the right place to leave the evening. I really like your point about democracy being a game of participation. You can't really expect anyone else to do it for you. And if you want to make a difference in your community, if you want the wetland or the forest that is threatened not to be developed, and you want to hold the elected officials accountable, then it's kind of up to you to do it. And again, you're not alone. I mean, we are hopefully going to be able to add some value if you come to speak to any of us that were on this webinar tonight, or our organizations, whether that be from a legal perspective or a campaign perspective or a science perspective. We can actually help you out, but it's really going to be the work that occurs at that local level that is going to make this politically relevant in the next election, and I really hope that we could all work together on that. So I'd like to now just thank everybody who tuned in tonight. I know that I saw just hundreds of comments rolling in the comments section, you talking to each other. So thanks so much for tuning in. I know many of you tuned into our first one that occurred before Christmas. We'll be doing more of these, as I mentioned, as we go forward. And I'm so encouraged to see so many of you taking action at that local level and really gearing up to make it impossible to continue this kind of attack on our environment. I've provided on the screen here, you can see some links that I mentioned earlier. You can make comments on what's going on with Minister's zoning orders by following the link that's there. You can visit the Yours to Protect website. And we're going to be following up with everyone who's on this webinar this evening with a survey, just to find out what some of your needs are and what we can do to better support you going forward. So you'll be getting that over email very soon. As well as where you can see this webinar if you want to have a look at it again. So that'll be coming very, very soon. I'd also like to thank all of our speakers who joined us this evening. It's really great to count on you for your insights and for your knowledge and for your ongoing support for communities as we move forward in this. So thank you so much, Anastasia, David, and Anne. And just last but not least, we really are going to need all of you involved with our Yours to Protect campaign. If you want to get more involved organizationally, get in contact with us. If you need more information, visit the website. We can put you in touch with the people that really can help you up your game and be really effective at that local level. And we're going to need you as well to help each other and to link together. So thanks very much for joining. Looking forward to working together in the future, and have a great evening. Take care.